I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center, and welcome to the Jewish Study Center, everybody. As treasurer, I always tell people that our classes are free, um, but we do have some expenses. For example, bringing the Zoom together. So we would appreciate donations. We don't require donations. We don't say how much you should give or you shouldn't give. But if you want to give, we would appreciate it. You can go to our website, www.jewishstudycenter.org, and click on donate. And then you can donate from your PayPal account or with your credit card or by writing a check. If you signify you want to write a check, the website will tell you where to send the check. Okay, that's my treasurer duties. Now, a few technical points. This session is being recorded. After the whole class is over, I'm going to delete the part that started before I spoke, and then I'm going to post the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to every registered student to give a link to where the recording is. Also, you might notice that the closed captions are on, so if you can't understand my long time New York accent from decades ago, you can look at the closed captions. And also, we want your comments and your questions. Everybody is muted, so you can't just speak out your comments or questions, but put them in the chat box and address it to everyone. Sometimes you make a comment, someone will comment, your comment, etc. Sometimes someone will answer your question even. So put your comment and your questions in the chat box addressed to everyone. Okay, so now I get the privilege of introducing our speaker and topic of the day. Topic is free will. So many of us have choices, that we make choices, but do we really make choices, or is it really preordained? So the speaker, Jack Shlachter, is a rabbi. We have many rabbis who teach classes here, but he's also a PhD physicist. And he has been a long-time physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, working on nuclear type things. And he's a rabbi at Los Alamos and at Santa Fe and other places every once in a while, like he's about to go to Guatemala to officiate at the holiday services over there for the high holidays. Jack is a scholar, Jewishly and scientifically, but he's also a very good communicator, both Jewishly and scientifically. So I'm sure that we'll all learn and enjoy about free will, since we have probably chosen this class. So, Jack, I will let you take over now.
Thank you so much, Jerry. It's really a treat for me to speak in this venue, in this forum. I have to say that one of the real privileges is to get to kibitz with Jerry in advance of the talk. Jerry and his colleague Mindy Reiser work very hard to organize these talks, and I do encourage you to consider making a donation to them. This is just a wonderful platform. So indeed, with the introduction, you heard that I am privileged to have two parallel interests, one in science and one in Judaism. And I had a chance to speak this past summer in June in Los Alamos at a series called the Los Alamos Faith and Science series. And you can imagine Los Alamos being a science town. Faith and science are interesting confluence. And so there's a summer series of talks called Faith and Science. And I was asked if I would put a talk together. So after much deliberation, I decided that I would speak about free will, or did I really make that decision myself? That's the question I wanted to put out there. Um, and if you are a scholar of medieval Jewish philosophy and medieval Jewish philosophers, you're probably going to be disappointed in this talk because I'm not a scholar of that. We're just going to have drive-by introduction to the works of a minion's worth of Jewish medieval philosophers on the topic of free will. Many of them express their views about free will, and there's more diversity in opinion than you might have expected. Um, but there's a science side to this talk as well. So if you're an expert in medieval Jewish philosophers, but don't know much about modern biological research on free will, maybe you'll find something out in the latter half of the talk. On the other hand, if you're an expert on modern neurological studies of free will, uh, but don't know much about medieval Jewish philosophers, maybe you'll learn something from the first half of the talk. If you're an expert on both of these topics, you're probably not going to learn much of anything because I'm not an expert on either one of these. But I just thought it was an interesting confluence to look at what is being said about free will from the perspective of these two seemingly divergent groups of people, mostly medieval Jewish philosophers and mostly Jewish modern neurobiologists. Um, and at the end of the presentation, you'll get to choose whether you think that we have free will or not. Or maybe you won't get to make that choice. Depends on how you view the results of these studies. So I'm going to share my screen. And as I said, we're going to launch into a drive-by view graphs of many Jewish philosophers, medieval Jewish philosophers. I'm not an expert on this, but I found it quite interesting to at least examine or open some of the books that had been sitting on my shelf for a while that I probably hadn't looked at in any detail. These medieval Jewish philosophical works that largely have been translated into English. So even if you're not a scholar of Hebrew or Arabic, and I'm neither a scholar of Hebrew nor Arabic, you can still access these materials today because many things have been translated into English. So let's see if I do this correctly. Let's see. How am I going to advance this? Hang on one second. There we go. Okay, so from the Jewish philosopher's perspective, there's a core text, and that core text is from the book of Deuteronomy. It's chapter 30, verse 19. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. That certainly gives us some understanding that we get to make choices. Um, Similarly, you can imagine from a Jewish philosophical perspective, many people are uncomfortable with the idea that we're held responsible for our actions if we don't have choice about those actions. And so here we are in the month of Elul, approaching the Jewish high holidays. It seems like it's built into the system, if you will, in Judaism, that we have free will because we're held accountable for our behavior. Is the way we view this. Now, on the modern neuroscientist level, and I have to say, when I first got into this topic, I was really struck by how many modern neuroscientists who are exploring this topic of free will are Jewish. Many modern neuroscientists have been looking at the results of experiments on human beings over the last 40 plus years. And this was all new to me when I started putting this talk together. It's not an area that I was proficient at, but the experiments are intriguing. Intriguing in the sense that they certainly can support the idea that we don't have free will. That's what can come out of some of these experiments. So we're going to look into that as well. Okay, so free will, I'm of course talking about the idea that people are able to choose between doing one thing or doing something else. Now, there are people who feel that it's impossible that we could have acted in any way other than the way that we act. And so therefore they find our behavior to be incompatible with free will. These people are called hard determinists. So they believe that our behaviors are determined, and they have a very strong view about that. They're called hard determinists. There's another group of people who are called, as you might have guessed, soft determinists. They're also sometimes called compatibilists, and they believe that free will and determinism are somehow compatible, but they somehow generally have to soften the definition of free will. I'm not going to get into all those details. Again, I'm not expert on this. I really just want to expose people to the variety of views on this topic, which I didn't appreciate when I set out to put this talk together. So I wanted to start out with this individual. This is Philo of Alexandria. He is obviously not medieval. He's quite ancient, 20 BCE to 50 of the Common Era, and he's really an individual who's not so well known in Jewish circles. His works were mostly preserved. They were written in Greek and they were mostly preserved by the church fathers. But he was Jewish and he tried to combine Plato and Moses into one philosophical system. That's obviously not a photograph of him. It's not even probably a remotely accurate illustration of him. That was done in the early Renaissance period. But some philosophers followed Philo's writings, and they said that free will is built into human nature, into human souls, and that's a distinguishing feature between human beings and animals. So this was not the main topic of his writings, and so you can find places in Philo's writings where he's inconsistent on the topic of free will. I'll just read one little passage. Am I going to do that? Am I going to read a little passage? Maybe I'll skip over a passage of his. But he does say that the ability to choose between good and evil emerges from a knowledge of the difference between the two. But there are other places in his writings where he says that there's predetermination and that I would not say that he rejected determinism. This kind of waffling is really a result of the fact that basically Philo dodges the question of do we have free will? And in some sense, him being the first one out of the box here, first of our minion that we're going to look at, maybe expresses it better than anybody that we just don't know. And there are places where we think that it seems like we have free will and places where not so clear. The second individual who I want to talk about now does take us into probably the early Middle Ages, Saadia Gaon, 892 of the Common Era to 942 of the Common Era. So quite a big jump after Philo. And I happen to be in Tel Aviv at the moment. I'm flying back to the United States tomorrow, but I thought this was particularly apt because there we have a picture of a street sign in Tel Aviv. And one of the things I love about wandering around Tel Aviv is that you come across all these wonderful Jewish individuals just looking at street signs. So Saadia was very important. He really caused a shift, a very important shift in having the world view the center of Jewish thought to be not in Israel. So it's kind of ironic that this street sign is in Tel Aviv, but rather in Babylonia, where he lived. Sura is one of the cities where a very famous Jewish academy was. Sura and Pumbedisa, two of the major Talmudic academies, and Saadia was the head of that academy in Sura, and he shifted the perspective of world Jewry to acknowledge that the seat of authority really lay in Babylonia rather than in Israel. He wrote this very important work, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, and he, more than Philo, was trying to do a systematic integration of Jewish theology with ancient Greek philosophy. Yet another topic that I'm not expert on, by the way, is ancient Greek philosophy. But he really was important in combating a group called the Karaites, who were very strict literalists. They felt that the Torah was authoritative, but that the Talmud was simply written by human beings, and they denied its authority. And he tried to combat that view. So he was influenced not by well, by his surrounding environment, which was an Islamic world. And so in Saadia's view, there was no contradiction between our free will or our freedom of activity and the idea that God has prior knowledge of what people will choose. And that's usually the religious Jewish dilemma, is how can you have a God with foreknowledge and still have free will? If God already knows what we're going to choose, how is it that we are the ones who make that choice? So Saadia really tried to resolve that. And I do have a quote from a work of Saadia's that, let me just share this with you. God has furthermore told us that God has granted to human beings the capacity to obey God and has left it to human beings to act upon it, and has given human beings freedom of choice, but enjoined them to choose the good. Thus, Scripture says, "See, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil," which follows. Which is followed up later with the remark, "Therefore choose life." That was our Deuteronomy passage. So Saadia is aware of that Deuteronomy passage. He understands that it has something to do with free will, and he somehow is able to reconcile this with the idea of God having foreknowledge. This is going to be a theme of many of the medieval philosophers who, in fact, choose this free will idea. Um, we move next, and I did these chronologically, by the way. So the next individual is Bachya ibn Pakuda, and I may be getting these pronunciations all wrong because I only know about this stuff from my own reading. Bachya said, while man has the freedom to will and choose, the realization of his actions is dependent on God's will. Um, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm going to share with you a little more from Bachya. His major work is something called Guidance to the Duties of the Heart, and he's distinguishing this from the duties of the body. So, duties of the body are obligatory outward actions. So, this is like religious ritual and ethical practice. Duties of the heart are the attitudes and intentions that determine the state of a person's soul, and they give value to a person's acts. So he wrote this work because he felt that there was too much emphasis on duties of the body and not enough emphasis on duties of the heart. It's actually still considered to be a very important work. For example, Musar, if you're familiar with that, the intention behind our acts. And so he wrote this work, which is still studied to this day. Um, so there are 10 gates. They're called 10 gates or 10 ch major chapters, I guess you could call them, in duties of the heart. And the fourth gate is called Sha'ar HaBitachon. And here he says that there are, uh, well, how can I say this? That that people can believe that our actions are predetermined by God, and people can believe that our we have free will. But he says it's not the right question, which is right, that we should act that like we have free will, and at the same time, we should trust that God has predetermined our actions. So this is a little bit of that same waffling that we heard before, but it's an interesting approach, right? That we should act like we have free will, but we should also trust in God. And I'm just going to share with you a little passage from Bachya. He says, uh, Man and the other animals are but instruments prepared by the Creator for the adornment of the world. When God moves them, they move by God's permission, power, and ability. When God stops them, they rest immobile. And let's see. And then jumping down, it all points to the fact that man's actions are entrusted to him alone, and God has nothing to do with his good nature or good deeds, evil nature or evil deeds. This matter is very difficult for me, and the reconciliation of the two opposites is quite perplexing. If there is a cure of this malady, I wish God would cure me of it through you. This is a dialogue, if you will. So he's really setting out the great dilemma that everybody has in trying to resolve this issue. Um, Moving along, because I do want to get through our minion and move on to the modern neuroscientists, so I'm going to go fairly quickly here. Yehuda Halevi, you may have heard of him as a poet of great renown. I went to a slichot service last night, and one of the passages that we did at the slichot service was a poem by Yehuda Halevi. Wrote a very famous philosophical work called the Kuzari. And the Kuzari tells the story of a heathen tribe called the Khazars. And it's just a story. I mean, it's a legend. But the king of this heathen tribe was trying to decide what religion to convert to. And he sort of tried a bunch of leaders of these different groups out, and ended up speaking with a Jewish scholar and decided that that was what made the most sense. And so not only did he convert to Judaism, but this heathen tribe all converted as well. It's an interesting legend, and in fact, this legend has stayed alive for millennia. Arthur Kessler wrote a book called The 13th Tribe, and it recounts this legend of the Khazars. So then just to say a little more about Yehuda Halevi on this topic of free will, that only those actions which proceed from free choice are considered to be praiseworthy or culpable. He's influenced by the Greek Aristotelian schools, and sees no contradiction between free choice and the view that God knows in advance what we will do. Um, the next individual here, Avraham Ibn Daud, he considered that non-existence of absolute determinism, so the non-existence of absolute determinism, meaning that God does not have complete deterministic control, that's operational. In other words, the world is operating without absolute determinism from God, but he views that as a defect in the world, and that I guess we will get to a point where, in fact, there is strict determinism, but we're not there yet. An interesting concept. Maybe just sharing a little passage from Ibn Dowd. Let's see if I can find this. So, concerning what exists without being guarded and what is realized into the evil of one's own choice, the following is said, and I will harden the heart of Pharaoh. So this is actually a very important Torah passage about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and that is fodder, if you will, for anybody who is trying to support the idea of God predetermining how we behave, because there it is in, very explicitly in the text in the book of Exodus that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. There are workarounds that you're probably familiar with that, the first multiple times Pharaoh hardens Pharaoh's own heart, and then after Pharaoh has set off on this path, it's now says in the text that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, suggesting that we set patterns of behavior by choices that we make. And then at some point, it's very hard to make a different choice because we've set a pattern in motion. An interesting concept that I think has modern relevance. Um, More about his life, by the way, that he died as a martyr when Jews were being killed, and preferred to die for his faith rather than accept Christianity. Um, the next individual, probably the greatest of the philosophers on our list, is the great Moses Maimonides. And I love this passage that a modern scholar said, if one did not know that Maimonides was the name of one man, one would assume it was the name of a university. The guy was so prolific and such an incredible leader. This is a letter that he wrote about his daily life that I have often looked to whenever I thought that I was stressed with too many things to do. He said he would arrive home from the Sultan's palace, where he served as a physician to the Sultan. Um, and he would find the antechambers filled with both Gentiles and Jews, and he would go to heal them because he was this eminent physician. And then he would write prescriptions for their illnesses until the evening when he was extremely weak. He talks about eating only one meal a day and being exhausted and continuing to counsel the Jewish community because he was the leader of the Jewish community as well. Um, so he he says that human beings must have free will. And really, this is because he cannot reconcile lack of free will with the idea that God rewards and punishes. How could there be justice if we don't have free will? Um, Maimonides wrote several important works. He wrote one work which is an encapsulation of the entire corpus of Jewish law, known as the Mishnah Torah. This was written really for a general audience, and there he takes a very clear position on free will. He says every person may choose to do good or evil. Um, and he says it's outside of human understanding how that can be reconciled with God having omniscience, with God knowing everything. But he says it's just beyond our understanding of how to reconcile these things. Nevertheless, people clearly have free will. That was what he wrote in the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah 14 volumes. It was intended to be cutting to the chase. People don't have to read the Talmud. They can just read the Mishnah Torah and find the answers. Anyway, this was for a general audience. He did write a philosophical work, however, called The Guide of the Perplexed. And here he was targeting a more sophisticated reader, and he writes more cryptically. And here he says that the fact that God knows what will happen does not in any way abrogate man's free will. In other words, if an event has two possible outcomes, God's knowledge does not bring about the actualization of one of the two possibilities. So it depends who he's talking to, how he tries to reconcile free will and divine omniscience. Um, I do want to get through our minion, so I move along. Again, I'm just trying to give you a taste for the span of philosophers who are out there. And we're just going chronologically. So we've left the 12th century and moved into the 13th century now. Levi ben Gershon, or Gersonides, as he's sometimes known, he is a strict rigid Aristotelian. And I believe that you could think of that as rationalization of the world, probably kind of proto-science, if you will. And he wrote a mammoth work called The Wars of the Lord. It took him 12 years to write this. Here for the photograph, rather than a street sign, I'm showing you a stamp from Israel with Gersonides on it. And not only do we see a stamp with Gersonides, but you see that he has a piece of physics equipment in his hands, and he's using this to make observations. And he, according to at least one of the sources that I looked at, used data that he collected from his own observations, and he refuted the Ptolemaic model. So this is a very Earth-centric system with cycles and epicycles of sun and moon and planets going around the Earth, and complicated orbits. But he used his own observations to refute this Ptolemaic model. And this was one of the most important insights in the history of science. And yet, when we generally give credit to the heliocentric model of the solar system, where the sun is at the center of the solar system, we usually are crediting Copernicus. But if you know something about the dates of these individuals, you can see that Gersonides is well before Copernicus. Now, I don't know, I didn't do any deep exploration of that, but clearly this is a scientific mind. If he was involved in this understanding of how does the solar system work, so he's going to be dealing with free will from as rational and scientific a viewpoint as anybody can do, given his era. And according to the rabbi of the 20th century, Louis Jacobs, Gersonides was bothered by the old question of how God's foreknowledge can be compatible with human freedom. And what Gersonides held was that God knows beforehand all the choices that are open to each individual, but God does not know which choice the individual will make. That human beings have the freedom to make choices. God knows what all the options are, but that God does not know which of those choices the person will select. It's a very different perspective on free will and divine omniscience. And now here you see some astrology creeping in. The constellation under which a man is born determines his nature and fate, but it has one limitation. The free will of man could shatter the course of action ordained for him by the stars. So very strong understanding of free will. Not only does the constellation not control it, but God's pre knowledge doesn't control it either. Um, this is somewhat analogous. If you're familiar with Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum, it's a little bit related to that. Tzimtzum is this a little bit of a Big Bang idea, if you will, in Jewish mysticism, that God contracted God's self in order to make room for the universe. And so this is a self-limitation on God's part in order to allow the universe to be created. And so you could say that maybe that's what Gersonides is kind of hinting at, that God could know what will happen, but God chooses not to know what will happen, leaving us with free will. It's an interesting idea. And the passage that we're looking at there reflects Gersonides' views as represented in the Book of the Wars of the Lord. Chastai Crescus, quite a different approach. So we're now in the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century. His work was very influential in shaping Spinoza's system, and he does not agree with other philosophers. He doesn't agree in the following way. He says that this is not the scientist par excellence like Gersonides and Maimonides. This is a person who says the human mind is too limited and cannot arrive at the knowledge of God, no matter how great is his mind, and only through love of God and fulfillment of commandments can man come close to God. And he very much is not an Aristotelian. He points out mistakes in the philosophy of Aristotle. He was imprisoned in the late 1300s. His son died as a martyr. And his major philosophical work, known as Or Adonai, or the Light of God, that became a classic Jewish refutation of medieval Aristotelianism. So he very much pushed against that rational idea. And here's a street sign, I think, in Jerusalem this time, the opening of Crescus Street in Jerusalem. Um, so he, as I said, rejected the Aristotelian ideas and inclined toward the limitation of free will. Um, so, and as I said, he's going to come up again when we see Spinoza. But one of the things you can read about Crescus is that he thinks that this idea uh, that that we feel that we have free will, but still that there's self that that in reality, we don't have free will, I guess is the right way to say it. He thinks that this idea should not be made known to the masses. And this is one of the problems that often comes up when people talk about free will, that if we don't have free will, you certainly don't want everybody to know that, because then they won't think that there's any justification for punishment for anything that they do wrong, and that, just all hell will break loose. So, he is concerned that we not spread that idea around too much. As I said, he was influential in the development of Spinoza's philosophy, and Spinoza is going to be a little bit of a segue to our science piece of the talk today, because who did Spinoza then influence? In 1929, Einstein, the great scientist Einstein, was asked in a telegram whether he believed in God. And Einstein's response to the telegram was, quote, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists. I do not believe in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." That is a very Spinozist concept of God. As you probably know, Spinoza was put into excommunication, if you will, at the age of 24. He challenged rabbinic authority. He challenged the idea that the Torah was written by God. He had a very clear understanding that the Torah was written by multiple writers and then edited and woven together. And he was somewhat isolated, both by personality, I think, and by this excommunication. And he continued to write what would be called heretical ideas in his day, but were quite important. I can just share with you this passage from Spinoza. The infant believes that it is by free will that it seeks the breast. The angry boy believes that by free will he wishes vengeance. The timid man thinks it is with free will that he seeks flight. The drunkard believes that by a free command of his mind he speaks the things which when sober he wishes he had left unsaid. All believe that they speak by a free command of the mind, whilst in truth they have no power to restrain the impulse which they have to speak. So you can hear a clear understanding about lack of free will, that things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case. This is sort of that nature is driving everything, if you will. And it's sort of prototypical of the modern non-free will believing neuroscientists. So that's our minion, I think, if I was keeping track, or maybe this is number 10. Not going to spend much time on him, but it kind of brings us to almost modern times, known as the Ishbitzer, Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Izbika, known as the Ishbitzer, the 19th century, first half of the 19th century in Poland. And really, I don't have much in my own reading. So this is sort of secondhand information about the Ishbitzer from one source that I looked at. And he denies that man has free will and says that all is determined by God. You can read hints of that, I think, in his Torah commentary known as Mei HaShiloach. But I would say I found it a little bit tricky to understand some of the nuance here. Just very quickly, I wanted to touch on Jewish mysticism because I alluded to that earlier. Here you have a picture of the life of Pi, by the way. I couldn't resist because if you've read that book, there is I think it's a yacht in the book. I'm not exactly sure what kind of a sailing vessel it is, but it's known as the Tzimtzum, which I think is quite amazing. And Tzimtzum, as I mentioned before, is this idea of God contracting God's self, which is related to the idea of God choosing not to know what choices we will make. Um, this is just a potpourri of more modern Jewish philosophers. I'm not going to spend any time on them other than to say that you do see some range of understanding of free will here. Herman Cohen, freedom of will does not exist. Martin Buber saying free will is given even though in the realm of I-it, causality rules, but he's of course striving for the I-thou relationship. Heschel talking about limitations on our free will based on our environment, our society, and our character, and Mordechai Kaplan with his own views on this. Okay, now we are at neuroscience, and I'm going to use the last 15 minutes here to just share with you something that was completely unfamiliar to me when I set out on this. And this is a set of experiments that were begun in the 1980s by a scientist whose name was Benjamin Libet. I believe that's how it's pronounced. A Jewish scientist, by the way, a Jewish neuroscientist. And it's his experiments that really kick off modern neuroscientific understanding of free will. So, leaving our philosophers behind, but with the idea that the philosophers do span the space of whether we have free will or not, the same thing is going to hold, I can tell you up front, for the modern neuroscientists as well. And yet, now, instead of text-based or Greek philosophy-based understanding of the right answer, we're using neuroscience experiments. But again, there's going to be ambiguity. So what is the set of experiments that are known as Libet type experiments? Libet wanted to know if you can record an electrical signal in the brain before you have the conscious intention to make a decision. So, what is the decision? It's a simple decision. It's pressing a button. The experiment is you are free to push your finger down and press a button anytime you want to do it, but you're supposed to look at the clock when you make the decision that you're going to press the button, and then you press the button. And there are electrodes on your scalp that are recording signals. So they record the signal that is the motor neuron for pushing the button. And they also record the time when you say you made the decision. And what the Libet experiments showed is that there is detectable neuronal activity before you have made the decision to move your finger. That is the intriguing part of all of this. And as I say, these experiments began in the 1980s and they continue to this day. I'm not sure if it's my next slide. I think it's my next slide. No. So let me tell you just a little bit about him. A Chicagoan like me, I'm proud to say. These experiments in the 1980s were extremely important for this topic of free will in modern neuroscience. And his conclusion, this is very important. He says, my conclusion about free will, one genuinely free in the non-determined sense, is then that its existence is at least as good, if not a better scientific option than is its denial by determinist theory. So even though he did these seminal experiments and they indicated something quite unusual about free will, he did not reject the idea of free will. So now we're going to see what his experiments look like. And if I did this right, which would be a miracle, of course, we actually have a graphic, like a moving graphic on the screen. I hope you can see that, where you see the counter going 0, 1, 2, 3, and then it repeats 0, 1, 2, 3. And what's going on? You have a clock. So the little red dot is moving around on the clock, and you are supposed to look and see where that dot is on the clock when you make the conscious choice to move your finger. And then at some time later, your finger actually moves. So that part we understand that it takes some time for the impulse to get to your finger, to move your finger. But what's interesting is that if you start at zero, um, you there is a detected signal, but that comes before you see the clock at the time you make the decision. And again, I am absolutely not an expert on this, but I guess it's at number one that you pick up a signal on the EEG, and it's at number two that you note the position of the dot on the dial, and it's number three when your finger actually acts. So zero is a resting state. One is when there is a recorded signal from your brain. Two, which comes later, is when you think you made the decision. That is the intriguing part of this whole experiment. And that is really quite critical for many modern neuroscientists. Again, maybe intriguingly to me, I don't know if it's intriguing to anybody else, but virtually every neuroscientist that I looked at on this topic is a Jewish scientist. So what Libet said, and I'm gonna share a little more with him, and then we'll see the other ones, and then we'll wrap up. But what Libet said, and you have the quote there, that conscious free will controls it basically what it is that we have what he called free won't. In other words, there are these different possibilities that can all happen, and then we can veto uh, something and abort a decision that looks like it's ballistic, meaning that it's no longer something we can control. We can abort that, and that's the choice that we make is what he calls free won't. So he says that his experimental results are entirely compatible with the notion of free will. He finds that conscious volition is exercised in the form of the power of veto, what he called free won't. Um, and these experiments have been repeated many times and in many different variants, but he's really the father of all this. Now, I do want to get to this group of modern neuroscientists, and my suspicion is that this is maybe a larger group than the others. These are modern neuroscientists, including Robert Sapolsky, who influenced my thinking a great deal on this topic, whose book called Determined really set me off on this whole topic. They argue against the existence of free will, and they think free will is an illusion, and that what happens is that we create the concept of free will to explain our actions after the fact, that we make a choice and then we retrofit it with free will because we are so wedded to the concept that we have free will that we create a scenario that as if we made that choice, but they do not believe that we really make that choice. Um, Sapolsky is pretty convinced of that, hence the title of his quite popular, very recent book called Determined. But he's not alone. I'll just mention Christopher Hitchens, who passed away in 2011. Samuel Harris, born in 1967, Jerry Coyne, born in 1949, all Jewish scientists, neuroscientists, or with some neuroscience involvement, biologists, all who thought there is no free will. I thought it was very astounding. Um, Sapolsky, raised as an Orthodox Jew, focused on neuroendocrinology, and he says there is, quote, there is no free will, or at least that there is much less free will than generally assumed when it really matters. And this quote, I thought, brings us back to the earliest parts of our talk. He says, and I quote, that after learning in synagogue about how God hardened Pharaoh's heart, he woke up one night at 2 a.m. as a teenager and said, "Oh, I get it. There is no God and there's no free will. The universe is this big, empty, indifferent place, and that's kind of where I've been ever since." I was very intrigued by this. I actually communicated with Sapolsky, and I was incredibly honored to get an email back from him. And he says every time some proponent of free will insists that neurons can have spontaneous action potentials, um, they're just wrong. I mean, he just really is convinced there is no free will. So then I asked him, well, what about atheism? Where do you come up with that? And he said, that's another story. No matter how much everything cleanly fits into being the product of antecedent causes operating with the physical laws of the universe, basically, at some point, you know, he has zero intellectual basis for his atheism. It's entirely emotional. I thought that was very interesting. I do want to say there are other modern neuroscientists who in fact, think that the Libet experiments are flawed in the sense that they're making decisions about something that's very unimportant. When should you move your finger? That if you're talking about more important decisions like when should you get married or when should you take a job or should you move to a different country, these are much more complex. They require much more sophistication. And there are modern neuroscientists, and I'll show you just a few real quickly. Again, all who happen to be Jewish. I don't know why that is. But Victoria Templer Rockout, we've been without women through this whole thing, and I apologize. No no medieval Jewish women philosophers, no neuroscientists up to this point that I was mentioning, but there are major women researchers in this area who actually do think that we have free will and some control. I'm going to skip over that. Uri Maoz, I communicated with him as well. I was really pleased to find out about his work, and I was quite amused actually by something on his website. It says, you experience it to be within your power to stop reading this paragraph. And then he goes on to say, apparently you freely decided to continue. Perhaps you are curious how it will unfold. Anyway, I thought this is very amusing. This is on his website at Chapman University, and I thought it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek about whether you have free will or not. But I'm going to conclude by saying this is a quote from Christopher Hitchens, but I think it was said earlier by Isaac Bashevis Singer that we must believe in free will. We have no choice. And so, what I'm hoping is that you came away from this with a little more awareness of some of the amusement that can come by exploring this topic, and also some of the breadth of ideas out there. And nevertheless, I'm going to wish all of you a Shana Tova and hope that the balance of the month of Elul is productive and that you do apologize to others for any bad behaviors you might have made, whether they were your choice or not. And let me see if I've got, oh yeah, so faith and science, let me choose to talk about this. There's my email address, physicsrabbi@gmail.com. That's pretty easy to remember. I'm delighted to hear from anybody who wants to send me an email, physicsrabbi@gmail.com, and my website, www.physicsrabbi.com. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Jack. I was certainly fairly amused by, especially the last quote that no choice but had to have free will. Uh, that's great. Let me make a few comments before we go into the questions. One thing is that you said a few times that you're not an expert in these subjects, but it's something that basically intrigues you. And that goes back to the beginning of the Jewish Study Center. Our motto is come learn with us. So the idea is to have people who are intrigued about a subject, who may be expert, may not be expert, but share with the others. So you're right in there. And the other part is if someone wants to teach something or wants to learn something, they should email us at info@jewishstudycenter.org. And the way I got in contact with you was kind of like that. You were watching one of our programs about black cantors. I noticed you were from New Mexico, where I lived at one point. So I started talking to you, and you volunteered to teach classes. I mean, that's a great way to have programs. So if anyone in the audience or who's watching a recording later wants to teach something or wants to learn something, please email us at info@jewishstudiescenter.org. Um, and also talk about recordings. The previous class that Jack taught was about Oppenheimer versus what I would call Strauss, or Strauss as he pronounced it, about the controversy between um, um, Richard Oppenheimer and Strauss about well, about everything almost, and how Strauss basically worked to withdraw Oppenheimer's security clearance. It was a very big international, well, national certainly, controversy, and it was covered fairly well in the movie about Oppenheimer, but Jack covered it more in the Jewish aspects of it. So anyway, those are my comments about that. About free will, I'm not quite understand that. It seems to me, if I know someone well, like, suppose I knew you well, Jack, and you had a choice. I said, "Oh, I know Jack's going to choose that because I know you so well that I think he's going to do that." I mean, God knows us better than I know you, so God knows what we do. So to me, I'm with one of those guys you're talking about, that God knows everything. We still have free will, but God knows what choice we're going to make. That's my little piece. Okay, so questions. One person says about, in the questions on the one about the uh, press a button, about the person who decides not to push the button at all. How does he get involved? And there's other questions of that sort. So amusing little questions. And another person as well. Okay, the brain registers something a moment before you press the button, but it's still your free will when you press it. Anyway, there's all kinds of questions about how well that experiment really determines whether we have free will or not. So this it's
Yeah, I
very
definitely recommend reading the book Determined. That's where I learned about the Libet experiments in the first place. There's a fair amount of neuroscience in the book. I would have to reread it to understand it better. But if you're intrigued by those experiments, there's a lot of literature out there on it, far more explanatory than what I could cover in this presentation.
Let me make one more comment. You talked a little bit about Spinoza, and he's often considered the father of modern philosophy in some sense. When we read his book on ethics, which is really about his philosophy about whether God exists and stuff, and he writes it in a what do you call it, like Euclid, theorem proof type thing. So my professor called in Hyman Bass, who was a famous, a young, very good mathematician at our university, to say whether the way Spinoza wrote was really scientific or not, even though he was using a Euclidean format. So I don't know what Bass said, but it was interesting that to call in a mathematician to check Spinoza's logic, basically, it was quite an interesting way of doing things. Uh, so. Let's see. Other questions? Also, people can raise their hand, and if you raise your hand, I can let you ask your question out loud if you will. You can raise your hand, by the way, on the bottom of your screen. If you click on, I think it's React, then you can do a electronic raising of your hand. Okay, let's see. Someone says that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. Is that space where the free will is? Well, and so is free will hard. Well, anyway, there's lots of comments, and I guess I don't really have enough knowledge to understand some of these nuances of free will. I guess I don't have free will, but anyway, uh, that's
I
all.
should make a plug for the for your organization, the Study Center, Jerry, and just say, all of you out there should make donations. You really don't have a choice. You only think you have a choice about making donations, but they could use the support.
Yes, well, you chose to help us, but I knew you would do that.
Actually, to be a little more serious about this, one of the things that I thought, well, let me just share two quick things about the book Determined by Sapolsky. One is his interest in serving as an expert witness in trials of individuals who, let's just say, grow up with a crack addicted mother, no father, in an environment where there's no good role models, with poverty, with malnutrition during formative ages, and then commit a crime. And for the prosecuting attorney to say this person had choice about whether to commit that crime or not, he has been brought in at times to say, do you really think this person had a choice here? The deck was so stacked against them, and I think that's an interesting aspect that clearly is more important than pressing the button with your finger. The other thing from the book that I thought was incredibly helpful, and I read the book probably a year ago, and this one has stuck with me. I'll just share this quickly because I want to make sure that others who have questions can raise them. But I found myself being slightly more tolerant towards the behavior of others toward me after I read the book Determined, because I just started to tell myself the person really didn't have a choice in what they said or what they did that I found hurtful. I'm just going to try to let it go. And I actually think it helped a little bit. And so, to the extent that there's some value in that, I encourage you to look into that more. And now I
Well,
see Stuart has a hand up.
that also relates to current events. I mean, all this anti-Semitism and all these other feelings around this country and also in Europe and other places. Um, with all the press coverage of various events and things, how much are people really free will doing things? But I have another question to you, though, a real question that doesn't relate exactly to free will, but something you said about you said it was a myth about the Khazar. I read the book you're talking about, written
The
in
13th tribe.
1939, I think,
Hmm.
but I thought that was real. And in fact, a lot of people after that have used that as an anti-Semitic thing that we Jews don't really come from the Middle East, we come from this uh, kingdom that became Jewish. Is that really a myth, or is that reality?
I'll have to do some more work on that. I thought I had read somewhere that that was a myth, but I could be mistaken.
I thought it was real, but I'm not an expert. I mean, you're not an expert. I'm less of an expert than you are, but I thought it was a real thing, but I don't know. I
I
don't
think
know.
Stuart wants to unmute. Do you have to unmute him?
Yes, I will unmute him and I will bring him in. Think I can bring him in. Okay, you should be able to unmute.
Whoops. I just lost.
You are
You are
unmuted.
unmuted. We hear
Okay.
you.
So I was wondering if you might apply what you've talked about to the Garden of Eden and the tree of good and evil, and uh,
Excellent.
how that all comes
Excellent.
together.
Excellent. No, that's a great comment. Yeah, I think that definitely is related to that story because that's like the first story where it appears like choices are made and then there are consequences for the choices. Um, and yet, many things that I've read on that story that help me to interpret it is that this was the only way to get people to leave the garden. If you're living in nirvana and yet your job in the world is to try to go out into the real world and improve the world we live in. Somehow you're going to have to get pushed out of the paradise, or you're never gonna make any progress. And so, that was a setup. I mean, that is another way to read that story, that God created that whole situation so that people thought that they had that choice and that they made the wrong choice and they got punished and they had to leave, when in fact that was the only way that this could ever have worked out. So no, there's a very good comment, Stuart. But at least when I have talked about that story of late, I like the idea that maybe this was what had to happen, and it's not really punishment. It's the only way for the world to move forward. Thank you.
Well, related to that, though, is that, I mean, again, I know even less about Kabbalah, but Jay McCrensky often teaches about Kabbalah on our program. Um, you know, the impulse to do evil is often what gets us to do things which need to be done, like go to work and accomplish things so you can make money. So sometimes even things which are not considered good could really result in good in the end. So it's very
Very
complicated
important
stuff.
rabbinic teaching that without the evil inclination, that nobody would get married, nobody would build a house, nobody would do anything productive. So yeah, I mean, there's a flip side to that as well. You're right.
Anyone else? If you raise your hand, especially electronically, I can't really see people very much with uh, your picture. I would invite people to comment if you wish to. Okay. Um, the comments largely are like this one here. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation, Shanatoga. I mean, I've made some comments, I guess, but um, people are overwhelmed by what you've taught us, and some of the philosophy that you have, that maybe if we believe in determinism to some extent, it may explain to us what people do, and change our own attitudes about things, like even the tree of the snake going, the whole thing about Eve and the snake and stuff. And a lot of these things which we think were free choice, may not have been, or even if they were, they led to good things. So it's a very different concept than most of us learned when we were children. Okay, so it is 2:15. It's time to end, and you have to get ready for your trip back to the States for tomorrow. And we all have things to do. I have another meeting about security tonight because I'm also a co-leader of security for our synagogue. So anyway, thank you people for coming. This coming Wednesday, we'll have the second session of a class on women cantors, and there'll be an interview with two prominent cantors, including the lady who founded the Women's Cantors Network. So we've had an interesting class. And after that, we'll have a New Year's break, basically, for a few weeks, and come back with some programs are not yet determined, but are in mind. Okay, so with that, I will close up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoy the way you present things anyway. I mean, besides the content and stuff, so it's good.